The League of Women Voters in my time was a significant influence legislatively in Springfield. What's happened since is that as a result of the success of their campaign, they are largely in a ceremonial position in the General Assembly. The people who were committed to them are no longer there, and so I guess that one might say they got their just due, but it is unfortunate that as a result of it, I think that some of the good government impulses of the League have not been realized and in fact no longer exist as a legislative force in Springfield.
So if you were to speak with current leaders of the League, what would you recommend to them?
Well, I think that I would tell them about the way their organization was before they arrived on the scene. They were a vibrant, dominant, effective force in Illinois government, and they are no longer. Really, they are a nice society, and they meet in different places, and they do some sort of educational work. But as I have observed it, they are no longer an effective lobbying force in Illinois, which they once were, and I think the message is rather obvious. I wouldn't have to spell it out.
So you think reviving cumulative voting would increase the League's effectiveness?
Oh, well, there's no question about it. The very people who would benefit the most from the cumulative voting would be the very people who would listen to the League. Because when we were legislators elected by cumulative voters, we had to listen. We had to be able to appeal to a constituency, and if we didn't listen, we couldn't appeal to that constituency. I could not depend on my legislative leaders to reelect me. I could not depend on even my local Democratic committeemen to appeal to me. I had to myself make sure that I had a constituency that I was listening to and appealing to, and that constituency would assure my reelection regardless of whether I did or did not do what the leaders of my party wanted me to do.
And the League is part of that constituency?
Well, the League was a significant part of my constituency. I happened to come from a district where the League of Women Voters was a very important force. Now, I should tell you, incidentally, that with regard to the League of Women Voters statewide adopted this position against the cumulative voting system and in favor of the cutback amendment. But I do want to tell you that my local leagues did not. The North Shore leagues, I think they knew a good thing when they had it, and they opposed the state league's policy, but they were overwhelmingly beaten in the contest within the League of Women Voters.
I see.
So the League itself was not monolithic on the issue, but they ended up making what, both from their own point of view and even more from the point of view of the state of Illinois, they made a mistake.
Do you think that the House was more bipartisan with cumulative voting?
Well, perhaps, I think with cumulative voting, the House was certainly more bipartisan. They were also multi-partisan. That is, they were listening to different forces that were involved. Bipartisan you think of as being two parties, but there are really opportunities for more than two parties. For example, we talk about bipartisan Republican-Democrat, but in my district, for example, our three legislators just happened, not intentionally, but just happened, let us say. One of us was Protestant, one was Catholic, and one was Jewish. Now that's because our constituency was roughly divided about 1/3 of each, something like that. Similarly, there were other partisans, if you want to put it that way. There are different racial groups. There are, for example, black-white is something that is not just Democrat-Republican. Uh, in the period when we did have cumulative voting, the closest mirror to the national results of presidential elections was found in the Illinois House. In other words, when it all shook down in the final analysis, when it all shook down, where do you look for to get approximately the same percentage in Democrat Republican that is mirrored in the cast votes, in the votes cast for the leader, the President of the United States running in Illinois? And almost invariably it was in the Illinois House of Representatives, in spite of the fact that we were not voting on a straight Democratic Republican. The truth is that when you put it all together, when you winnowed it all out, and you finally tabulated the composition of who the voters elected to the Illinois House, and you compared that to those elected, how the voters expressed themselves for president, you would find that the Illinois House was easily the group that mirrored the general vote for the presidency, much more so than the Illinois Senate, that was also running, but running on a straight party basis. So the House was a very democratic, with a small d, body.
Many people, do you find that the Illinois House with cumulative voting was sort of a beginning for careers of other people who would go on to other things?
Well, that happened, but there was a coincidence that occurred as to, whether the people who came through the Illinois cumulative voting system ended up in the leadership of the state. And I was elected on the orange ballot, and that was a unique event in Illinois history. It is true that a number of the people elected with me did go on to good government and high positions, but I would not want to say that it was a result of cumulative voting. I mean, all I would tell you is that the cumulative voting afforded an opportunity for people of goodwill who happened by birth not to be of the majority party in their district. Under our system of government, if you are not of the majority party, by mere coincidence of birth, you are precluded from serving in the legislature. That's a rather severe penalty to an accident of birth. With cumulative voting, you could always, whether your father was Democrat or Republican, you could aspire to the General Assembly, which is the opening gambit on a political career. You can establish a reputation once you get into the House, but if you don't get in the House, it's very hard to establish a reputation to give you a platform that will, from that point on, enable you to rise in state government. That's what a cumulative voting system did. It opened up government regardless of your parentage, your color, your party background. There was a place for you. You could build your constituency and get elected. From then on, it was up to you.
And that's certainly, is that not the case now?
Well, certainly that's not the case now. I mean, there is many districts in Illinois where it's overwhelmingly Republican, overwhelmingly Democrat. I mean, let us take a young person who is born in this great city of Chicago, Illinois, who by mere coincidence of birth and also perhaps of education has unfortunately become a Republican. Now that poor kid is destined to spend his life without the opportunity to run for the General Assembly, because for all practical purposes, if you are a Republican in Chicago, you have no opportunity really to run for the Illinois House of Representatives, because that's all Democratic. And no matter how able you are, no matter how devout you are in your principles, you went to the University of Chicago and you became a devout conservative and you want to do something for the good of your country and to advance this new philosophy you have picked up at the University of Chicago, to advance republicanism and to do something to prohibit the spread of democratic doctrine that is threatening the country, there's no practical opportunity for you to run for the Illinois House of Representatives because there is no opportunity in the whole city of Chicago to successfully mount a campaign for the Illinois House of Representatives. Now, you may be able to run for something within the Democratic Party, but it's so overwhelmingly Democratic that you can't do it. And similarly, in various other places in Illinois, can you imagine a poor kid born as a Democrat in DuPage County? What he is going to have to carry with him for life, he's going to not be able to run for the General Assembly. I mean, if there was a constitutional provision prohibiting Democrats from running for the Illinois House of Representatives in DuPage County, it would be held unconstitutional. But as a practical matter, that is the situation that exists. Under cumulative voting, that wasn't so. Bill Redmond could not only run from DuPage County for the Illinois House of Representatives, he could be Speaker of the Illinois House, and that is what took place.
Why is that good for public policy?
Well, it is rather apparent that a public policy that opens government to citizens of whatever political persuasion, of whatever religion, of whatever race, is in keeping with the democratic ideal and promotes the democratic ideal. That's what democracy is all about. Of, by, and from the people, not the people of one color or the people of one party or the people of one race. It opens government to anyone who would want to be a candidate. If you're not able to be a candidate, no choice is presented to the citizens. And presumably that is what a democratic society is, to present the constituency with choices and give them an opportunity to make choices. But if there's no choice to be made, then it is the situation where public policy is being made by a few leaders of the party rather than by the constituency, just as right now, since cumulative voting ended in Illinois, as a practical matter, the decisions that are made in Illinois government are made when the legislative leaders sit down with the governor of Illinois and they decide what to do. And then it is brought to the Illinois House and the Illinois legislators cast their solemn vote exactly as their leaders have determined in the meeting with the governor. There is no opportunity as a practical matter to really make policy on the House floor where there is generated debate and an opportunity for public discussion in the open, not in the governor's office, and by individual legislators to do something about determining the course of events in Illinois. Quite apart from the political science aspects, it's really a much less exciting place that the Illinois House of Representatives is than when we were there some years ago before the cutback amendment.
Would you like to see cumulative voting reinstated?
I think that reinstating cumulative voting would be desirable from a point of view of the Illinois population. You know, this country needs more diversity. This is cumulative voting was a unique institution, not found elsewhere. Louis Brandeis once commented about the fact that the wonderful thing about the American government was that we have these different states that can experiment. They don't have to all be the same. That he was talking about passing legislation in one state that may be interesting to other states. Well, here was a great institution that was unique, that was serving an interesting and important purpose, and that suddenly got obliterated. Now we're like everybody else. I believe that there was more positive to be said for cumulative voting than negative, let us put it that way, and that on balance it was for Illinois a very good system. It permitted free and open discussion, free entry of individuals into the political system. It de-emphasized party control. It made it possible for individuals of whatever persuasion to run for government, and I think those were very positive aspects of Illinois government, and I would like to see it back again. Not that I have any interest in utilizing it, but I believe that the experience that I had is one that would be mirrored time and time again and was a positive as far as Illinois government was concerned.
What do you think the chances of the political climate allowing a return are?
The question as to whether the political climate will allow the return of it is one that one never knows. Who can predict political climate? I would never have predicted the demise. So accordingly, I could not permit or predict the arrival of this events that are going to make this possible. I think there is considerable Illinois discouragement with government. I think everybody knows that the legislative leaders, who incidentally I'm not denigrating, they are good leaders. That's what leaders always do. They don't want to be bothered by constituencies. They want to run things. That's the nature of human beings. I think everybody sort of knows that the Illinois House isn't what it once was, that serving in the Illinois House does not permit the excitement that it once did, and that that excitement was positive. I'm sure there can be a reversal of events in which some event can give rise to the rebirth of cumulative voting in the same way that that coincidence of events that brought about its demise. I hope so.
Well, I think this is the point where anything I've neglected to ask, or anything you'd like to summarize, it's your forum.
Oh, well, I think you've done a fine job of asking me, and for the what kind of tapes you were describing, I will.
Oh, you can go
Yeah,
as long as you like.
yeah.
Anything you'd like to say.
Hold on. Go ahead.
We're recording.
To try to bring about a rebirth of cumulative voting in Illinois, if I were going to do that, I think I would start with repeating what happened before. The great force that brought about cumulative voting in Illinois, interestingly enough, was the Chicago Tribune and the editor of the Chicago Tribune. A very interesting individual, a very able individual who went on incidentally to become mayor of Chicago, but a very, very public-spirited individual. The Tribune has always, as a result of that, had a particular affection for cumulative voting and the cumulative voting system. I believe that the same people who were dedicated to the system might still be dedicated to the system. It's something that was very tied in and tied up with the Chicago Tribune, which does happen to be our predominant newspaper in Illinois. That is a perfect beginning for this kind of event. I don't know whether some do-good groups like the League of Women Voters might change and decide to do something. You know, there is an opportunity that's presented that is not to be overlooked. There is built into the Illinois Constitution a provision that does permit the amendment of the Illinois Constitution as it relates to the legislative article by amendment, by petition, that doesn't have to go to the legislature. And that was embedded in the Constitution in 1970, and it was the basis on which a few malcontents and a few, I think, deceived do-gooders brought about the elimination of the system. But it can work both ways. And so if you had a mass organization and a mass newspaper, you could very easily do exactly the same thing that they did, present the issue to the voters again, and I think you may win on it.
Resolve the question that the forces of revival have not yet figured out is whether or not to A, go back to the big house of 177, or B, to feel constrained to the current size of the House of Representatives and use 3-member districts with 118 members. That would mean you'd have 3 existing state rep districts would be combined in a larger district, which would be larger than a Senate district.
And
But you wouldn't increase the size of the House at all.
you could also give us a more general answer in regard to that, was how was it with the 177? Was that a problem or an issue, the big house, your personal testimony on that half of the subject?
Yes.
Okay, one more point.
When I was in the Illinois House, the size of it was never viewed as a problem. Those who favored the elimination of the system at that time made it a problem. They alleged that it was more expensive supporting a larger house than it would be a smaller house, and they made great projections on how much money was going to be saved by reducing the size of the house. Well, the rather humorous thing is that, of course, when they reduced the size of the house, the expenditures for the legislative branch didn't go down, they went up. They dwarf what the expenditures were at the present time. The truth is that the amount spent on the individual legislators' compensation was very minimal in relation to the state of Illinois. It was not felt in the slightest. There was something very nice about having House districts that mirrored a Senate district, that all fell within a senator's district. It made it easy for people who lived to know the relationship between their House members and their Senate members. I do not believe that size is a significant factor. We were a very active House. That big house that we're talking about did so much more than the present smaller house that there's really no comparison. And I think that almost anybody honestly in the House recognized that we were far more active than the present House. The truth is that they don't need to be much larger because they're not doing it very much there. Nowadays, it's all being done by the legislative leaders and the governor. They're sort of more like a rubber stamp kind of mechanism. The bills that are permitted to proceed to vote are the bills that the legislative leaders let you proceed to vote on, so that they really are justifying the small size of the House because it's atrophying. It's not doing very much.
So do you think politically it's a better move to put it back to where, to the bigger house in order to have the coterminous districts, or do you think it'll be a problem with the electorate to do that?
Well, I believe that the coterminous districts that we had before was a very good and manageable system. In my kind of district, there was no problem at all with my kind of population in the Chicago metropolitan area. The senators were not running in an inordinately large district. There was no problem. The only problem were a few downstate districts where some senators said that they had too many miles to cover because they didn't have so many constituents. And since the state was being apportioned on the basis of people rather than dogs and cows and horses, which they once were before the Supreme Court decided you couldn't do that, those districts were more of a problem, but really they were wide open spaces. I never observed any senators who really had any significant problem covering downstate districts. They may have had to work a little harder, but on the other hand, the legislative compensation's gone up a lot since then. I think they really could manage, and in favor of a better system, which I believe the old system was, I think that the additional size was not a significant factor.
So you would support, you think, putting it back, if it just roll back the cutback, reverse the cutback, and it would be your line. Go back to 177.
Yeah, yes. Well, I don't know that you necessarily need 177. There's no magic in the number 177. You could decide how many House members you want. The only effect is that as you reduce the size, you increase the size of the districts in the Senate, and you would have a practical decision to make. The 177 House members was not ordained in heaven, and that is perfectly adjustable depending on the practicalities of the situation, and there could be a happy medium involved there. But I do believe that the idea of dividing a Senate district into sub-constituent House districts basically was a very simple and good system.
This is your chance to say anything else.
Hold on.
I would want to add is that I don't think that the cumulative voting system, the multi-member district system, ought to be decided just on the basis of whether it's coterminous districts for the Senate. I mean, I think those are divisible questions. And if it is decided that it needs to be more practically done so that the House is independent of the Senate, or that it be arranged in some other way, I think that that is a perfectly feasible way to go. I don't think that you ought to be hung up with the notion that the exact organization of the Illinois legislature that was in effect when I was in the legislature was ordained by God and cannot be changed by the reasonable decision of rational individuals. I am simply saying that a system that provides for multi-member districts of the kind that I had, in which minority representation is encouraged, is a desirable system, and that they ought to restructure the Illinois General Assembly in such a way as to not lose that little jewel that was created back in 1870 and got extinguished due to some adventurers in political governance and some misled do-gooders. And it had too much good to see it extinguished. It was a little jewel in the United States political system, and already there are different people around the country, unrelated to Illinois, who are starting to talk about the advantage of multi-member systems. And incidentally, there are other states and other cities that do utilize multi-member systems. Illinois is not the only state that utilizes multi-member systems. It is in terms of the way it structures the General Assembly, but there are different legislative bodies in different cities in different parts of the country that recognize the advantage of this, and there are those who are suggesting that there is something to be added to our body politic by recognizing and encouraging these diversities and differences and providing representation to different segments of the society who are underrepresented by the present system.
Now, I really do want to surrender you, and yet I've just got this one last thing I want to know, which is your line on drawbacks to admit it. You're a big advocate, and we hear you that. Will you admit to or note?
What are some of the drawbacks?
You've asked people that, or you might have something to say.
Well, I've actually talked about some of the drawbacks. I talked about the contest within the party. That's a big drawback, and I mentioned that subject. The size of the legislature is the uniqueness of it, the fact that others don't do it, therefore we shouldn't do it because others don't do it. The fact that it may be more expensive, I mean, haven't we already covered those?
How about the confusion for the voters? That's one of the things.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. One of the objections that is sometimes made about the old system that we had is that the voters are confused by bullet voting. Well, all I will tell you is that the system existed for a long, long, long time in Illinois, that the voters, when they voted on it as a result of the Illinois Constitution, specifically and very overwhelmingly voted to retain that system and not go to single member districts in a statewide vote with rather overwhelming results. It was only when this coincidence of events occurred, that when the legislature voted itself pay increases and when a few charlatans started viewing this as a way to show that they could become great figures on the Illinois political scene by exploiting this issue, that it went away. My constituents had no trouble with regard to that. I had no problem getting votes from my constituents. We explained in material that we leafleted our districts before the election, how the system worked. It never broke down, never any complaints about it, and the notion that individuals can't comprehend that they have 3 votes and that they may use it whatever way they like is not such a perplexing one that they cannot master quite simply on election. And it is very interesting that the body of legislators like myself had longevity in the legislature. The voters in our districts knew how to re-elect us. The proof was in the pudding.
Wonderful.
Great, okay.
My name's Dan Johnson Weinberger. Not sure whether I should make eye contact with the camera or look like this.
No, me.
Look at you?
Yeah.
Okay. The title will be Founder, Cumulative Voting Coalition. Illinois really has a unique opportunity in the movement for a better electoral system because we have a chance to bring back cumulative voting now. In most states, if you talked about cumulative voting or some other alternative electoral system, the establishment or the status quo politicians would sort of shake their head and blink their eyes and say that's academic and foreign and odd. But in Illinois, these establishment top people in Illinois recognize that minority representation is good for the entire state. And that's something that I think the entire movement for electoral reform ought to recognize. This opportunity to work with an existing base of support isn't around for much longer. The people who are elected under cumulative voting and understand its advantages and disadvantages are fading. They won't be around for much longer. Reviving cumulative voting in the year 2000 or 2002 is our best time to do it. In 1870, when Illinois implemented cumulative voting, we were an innovative leader in democracy. Since that time, the world has passed us by, and our using single-member districts and winner-take-all elections puts us in the back of the pack rather than leading the pack. In Illinois, when you talk to people, every now and then, when you find a white-haired activist or committeeman or even a congressman, they'll explode at the mention of cumulative voting and say, yes, yes, that was a great system, and that damn Pat Quinn ruined it for all of us. That sort of explosive, hidden support for an alternative electoral system is absolutely unique to Illinois and something that we cannot afford to let slip by. Some people say it'd be impossible to put this on the ballot and collect all those signatures, 400,000 to be safe. But if they could do it in 1980, so can we.
And we're organizing now, months and months and months ahead of time. There's no reason why an organized group of citizens can't get together over a big state like Illinois and get the necessary signatures to start this debate. The interesting thing is, I wouldn't dismiss out of hand the possibility that the General Assembly might decide to put cumulative voting on the ballot in the year 2000. Not only because a lot of the leadership was sort of born out of cumulative voting and really knows what it's like firsthand, but also that it's been 20 years since the cutback amendment. And that's sort of a long time for us to reassess and a natural period to look back and see whether it made sense or not. So it's an option that we ought to explore and go to Springfield and see if they'll put it on the ballot for us. The timing in the year 2000 couldn't be better, because in the year 2001 we'll be redistricting, which is a state nightmare. Using cumulative voting makes that process a lot easier. And in 2000, the idea of how we elect our legislature will be at the top of the agenda because of redistricting. The year 2002 is also a very good year to have cumulative voting on the ballot, because as a state, we will have just emerged from the nightmare of redistricting. And all of the lawsuits and litigation and political battles of how these lines are going to be drawn, which determines the winners, will have been very much on the front pages of our state's newspapers. And cumulative voting as a way to transcend many of these problems will be seen as a very nice, race-neutral, bipartisan way to get out of this mess. Let me read you a nice historical passage from Jack Vander Slick's and Kent Redfield's lawmaking in Illinois on single-member districts. The practice of representing people by districts is feudal in origin. People belonged to the land, the estates, shires, and other subdivisions. That tradition was brought to the American colonies and passed on to the states. Maybe we ought to reconsider whether our 600-year-old tradition of representing people by areas of land is the most democratic system. Joseph Medill, from the Debates and Proceedings of the Constitutional Convention of 1869, was recorded as saying this: "I believe it is only a question of time when the principle of minority representation will be applied to all legislative elections, in Europe and America, from Parliament or Congress down to village aldermen." He was right about Europe. They've instituted proportional representation. But his far-sighted vision for Illinois, unfortunately, didn't catch on in the U.S. Medill went on to say at the 1869 Constitutional Convention on cumulative voting, "It will give contentment to all classes of voters, secure representation for our long-enduring Republican friends in democratic Egypt, Southern Illinois, and give the swallowed up and buried under Democrats of Northern Illinois a chance also of being heard in our legislative halls by men of their own selection." During debate in Congress in 1869 over whether or not to use cumulative voting for the new House members for the rapidly growing nation, Ohio Republican James Garfield, later president, supported the amendment for cumulative voting and complained on the House floor that, quote, "a large portion of the voting people are permanently disenfranchised. There are about 10,000 Democratic voters in my district, and they've been voting there for the last 40 years without any more hope of having a representative on this floor than of having one in the Commons of Great Britain." One of the main forces behind cumulative voting's adoption in Illinois was Joseph Medill, owner and editor of the Chicago Daily Tribune, and one of the main forces behind creating the Republican Party. Some called him the kingmaker of Abraham Lincoln, the presidential convention of 1860. Medill himself was elected mayor in Chicago in 1871 on the fireproof ticket, popular ticket to be on after the Great Chicago Fire of 1870. But at the Constitutional Convention, Medill served as chairman of two committees, Electoral and Representative Reform and Corporations. He championed the use of cumulative voting for both. Speaking on behalf of the Committee for Electoral and Representative Reform, Medill testified in favor of cumulative voting as such. This great measure of reform will carry out pure democratic equality and equal rights for all men in the legislative halls, secure the equal representation of every citizen, the minority with the majority, man for man, allay partisan strife, reform legislative corruption, purify the elective system, inspire good and quiet citizens to attend the polls, enable virtuous citizens to elect pure and able representatives, and so on. He might have been wrong about the corruption part, but he was right on about the minority representation. The Constitution of 1870 was submitted to Illinois voters on Saturday, July 2nd, 1870. Voters approved the new Constitution and all of the separate provisions, including cumulative voting, which earned 59% of the vote. Illinois voters have never rejected cumulative voting when it was on the ballot by itself. In 1870 and again in 1970, cumulative voting was submitted to the voters as a separate proposition, and both times the voters approved it. In 1980, it was mixed in with cutting back the size of the House, and the voters bought it then. But they never rejected cumulative voting by itself. In 1870, the corporation was still a relatively new legal structure. It allowed businesses limited liability, so the directors wouldn't be held personally liable if the corporation went bankrupt. It also gave them access to the stock markets with a large amount of capital. The railroads were the first industry in the U.S. to really take advantage of the corporation, which infuriated the farmers who felt that the railroads were exerting way too much political influence and setting rates far too high. This sentiment of fighting back against the corporations led to the adoption of cumulative voting in Illinois. As Medill, also serving as chairman of the Committee on Corporations, noted, "We put our money into a stock company, and the first thing we know, it is confiscated by the ring. The men who get control of stock by proxies, which they coax or purchase on misrepresentation, elect the entire board and then do as they please. The remainder of the stockholders are in the dark. They have nobody in the board to watch over their interests, to protect against waste, extravagance, or mismanagement, or to take any steps to protect them until it is too late. This majority, having obtained absolute control of the offices of the company, proceed to plunder the stockholders. This practice is common, is notorious throughout the Union as well as within the state, and it is growing worse all the time. Cumulative voting for directors is to protect the minority from being plundered and robbed out of house and home, their stock confiscated and lost for the want of some representative to look out for their interests." Although no other state followed Illinois' lead in using cumulative voting for the House of Representatives, many states followed Illinois' lead in using cumulative voting for the election of the corporate board of directors in any corporations incorporated in that state. The first one to follow was Nebraska the next year in 1871. West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Kansas, and California all enacted these mandatory cumulative voting provisions by the end of the decade, and 10 more states joined them by the end of the century. To this day, many corporations still use cumulative voting, like Walgreens, Hewlett-Packard, Toys R Us, Avon. About 10% of the S&P 500 use cumulative voting. Let's look at how the electoral system works now and how gerrymandered these maps actually are. To my left is a map of northeastern Illinois. Here's a typical district. The red area, represents one Senate district, and the 40 and the 39 represent two separate House of Representative districts, each one electing one person. In the old days, this 20th district would elect 3 representatives at large. The cutback amendment drew this line and split it in half. You might notice how carefully drawn each of these lines are, block by block, street by street. It's because the map maker knows where the voters are and tries to precisely engineer each of these districts to elect one of their own. Just so happens, in the 90s, the Republicans drew this map, and this is a Republican gerrymandered map. The Democrats, if they drew the map, would draw it differently, but it would be as gerrymandered, as it was in the 1980s. Let's take a look at how the electoral system is designed now and how gerrymandered these maps actually are. There are 59 Senate districts and 118 state rep districts. Each Senate district, which used to elect 3 representatives by cumulative voting, now contains 2 separate districts, one for each representative. In the 59th, for example, in far southern Illinois, the northern part is the 117th district, and the southern part is the 118th district. You can see that line that divides them is not a straight one. That's drawn for a reason. Whoever drew that map drew it that way in order to maximize the chances of electing one of their own. It just so happens in the 90s that the Republicans drew this map. In the 80s, the Democrats drew the map, and I guarantee you the 59th district looked significantly different.
Right, I looked at it the whole time.
As an example of how districting and gerrymandering can affect the outcome, let's go to my college town, Champaign-Urbana. Here, in the 52nd senatorial district, in the old days, there were 3 representatives. Since it's a central Illinois area, the university town would have plenty of Democrats, but only a minority. And the rural Republican areas would elect 2 Republicans. Now, there's only 2 representatives to be elected. When the Republicans draw the map, they draw the line right through the college town of Champaign-Urbana, right here, splitting off the university Democrats in half. That elects now 1 Republican and 1 Republican. If the Democrats drew the map as they did in the 80s, they draw a circle right around the university town, making sure that 1 Democrat is elected there and leaving a Republican to represent the rural districts here. With cumulative voting, all of this nonsense is avoided because the Democrats can elect theirs fairly and the Republicans can get their majority too. With cumulative voting, the Democrat could get their 1 out of 3 representatives, like they should, because there are plenty of Democratic voters. And the Republicans could get their 2 out of 3, because they do have a majority of voters in the district, without dealing with any of this crazy gerrymandering, slicing through the cities or circling the university. DuPage County, just west of Cook County, is right here in northeastern Illinois. It elects its fair share of Republicans, but also elects all of the leadership of the Republican Party. This is where most of the new corporations have moved their headquarters when Sears moved out of the Sears Tower, moved out to DuPage County. It was really built up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This district here, northeast DuPage, which actually extends a bit into Cook, is where Pate Phillip and Lee Daniels, the Republican leaders in the House and Senate, are from. This district has about 70% of the voters voting a straight ticket Republican ballot. But from this area came Bill Redmond, the Democrat under cumulative voting, who rose to become Speaker of the Illinois House. And even in a district like that, where an unheard of 70% of the voters in 1994 voted for the straight Republican ballot, even from this Republican bastion, the Democratic voters were represented with the Speaker of the Illinois House. We used to have something very special in Illinois. We're in a state that's known for its almost feudal politics and backroom deals and isn't usually held up as a model of excellence. We used to have the best voting system in the country. And a lot of people recognize that. And I think for the sake of democracy with a capital D, we ought to revive cumulative voting in Illinois as soon as possible. If you're interested in joining this drive to revive cumulative voting, we need your help. We're trying to organize a coalition to bring back cumulative voting in the year 2000. Here are ways to contact us. Our voicemail is 773-508-4890. We have a website at www.prairienet.org/ICPR for Illinois Citizens for Proportional Representation. Our mailing address is P.O. Box 14314, Chicago, Illinois 60614-0314. The method by which we're trying to put this on the ballot by petition is to find 1,000 Illinois volunteers who are each willing to commit to collecting 400 signatures over a year and a half. If you think you might be one of those people, please contact us, because the only way we're going to put this coalition together is if people from all over the state get out of their living rooms and get into their friends' and neighbors' front doors and ask them to sign a petition to bring back cumulative voting. We'll also take donations because it won't be cheap. But please, please get in contact with us so we can organize a mass movement to revive cumulative voting in Illinois.